Of course, war is horrible, so why did the Palestinians initiate this war with their vicious attack on Israelis on October 7th?
Well, they didn't.
What do you mean they didn't?
They didn't. This war has been going on for 75 years. Israel initiated it in 1948 by ethnically cleansing 750,000 people. We must expel Arabs.
Get out of here.
We must expel Arabs and take their places.
The U.S.
We must expel Arabs and take their places, and if we have to use force, not to dispossess the Arabs of the Negev and Transjordan, but to guarantee our own right to settle in those places, then we have force at our disposal. David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, said that in 1937, and that's what they proceeded to do. The people in Gaza, this is what you need to understand. The people in Gaza, over 80% of them are refugees. Many of them are from a place called Majdal Asqalon in what is now southern Israel, in a city called Ashkelon. And they were dragged from their homes and driven from their homes, placed in prison camps, barbed wire prison camps, and then dumped in trucks in 1950 into the Gaza Strip, where they would be permanently warehoused. And then Israel proceeded to move Arab, Jewish refugees and Russians into Ashkelon to prevent them from ever coming back, and pass laws to prevent Arabs, Palestinians, from being able to return to their homes. 750,000 were ethnically cleansed. For 18 years, the remaining Palestinians, 100,000, were internally displaced inside Israel. The remaining were put under military rule. They were under military occupation until 1966. Then in 1967, Israel violently, in a war it initiated, occupies Gaza, occupies the West Bank, occupies the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights in East Jerusalem, and then invades Lebanon in 1982, attacking Palestinian refugees there, puts Gaza under siege in 2005. No one can get in or out without Israeli military permission. We must kill and kill all day, every day. That's according to Arnon Sofer, an Israeli government consultant who helped devise the siege of Gaza. For years, Israel would not allow certain chocolates and A2 paper into Gaza. And then they began these brutal military assaults, which they call mowing the lawn. And I talked to you about those assaults that took place on Gaza. So this didn't come out of a vacuum. You're not going to be able to hold people under siege, to cut them off from the world, and then expect them to just play along. That doesn't mean that I celebrate what happened on October 7th. It should have never had to happen. The reason it happened is because of the Israel lobby here, the genocide Democrats and the genocide Republicans who deny the Palestinians any right to have rights. And it's the right to have rights that defines you as a citizen. They're citizens of nothing. And now we see what Israel really thinks of them, really thinks of their children. Gaza has become a graveyard for children, according to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. So this didn't start on October 7th, and it's not going to end when there's a ceasefire.
I'm about to share one of the most important videos I've ever seen when it comes to understanding the mindset of Israelis. The man you're about to see is Israeli journalist Gideon Levy. He has been writing about the occupation of the Palestinian people for years and years and calling it out. He's going to describe the three things that most, if not all, Israelis believe about themselves. Listen very closely.
But I'll just give the three principles which enable us Israelis to live so easily with this brutal reality. A, most of the Israelis, if not all of them, deeply believe that we are the chosen people. And if we are the chosen people, we have the right to do whatever we want. B, there were more brutal occupations in history. There were even longer occupations in history, even though the Israeli occupation gets to quite a nice record. But there was never in history an occupation in which the occupier presented himself as the victim. Not only the victim, the only victim around. This also enables any Israeli to live in peace because we are the victims. The other day, Professor Falk spoke about this dual strategy of Israel of being a victim on one hand and manipulating on the other hand. after what happened in Paris and in Copenhagen with the terror attacks, Benjamin Netanyahu came with the notion all the Jews must come to Israel. It's the safest place for the Jews in the world. It's a shelter for the Jews in the world. Which is wrong, because Israel is today the most dangerous place on earth for Jews. But let's put it aside. It was only 24 hours later when he said Israel is an existential threat under the Iranian bomb. And I asked myself, how can you dare call Jews to come and to join this suicidal project when the Iranians are going to bomb us? But in Israel, everything goes, and both declarations were accepted as the only truth. And here I get to the third set of values which enable us Israelis to live in peace with the occupation. And this is maybe the most crucial one and the worst one. We say victimization, we say chosen people. When I say victimization, it goes without saying we have to mention the Holocaust and the unforgettable Mrs. Golda Meir. She said once, this unforgettable woman, that after the Holocaust, the Jews have the right to do whatever they want. But the third set of values is the most dangerous one, and this is the systematic dehumanization of the Palestinians, which enable us Israelis to live in peace with everything. Because if they are not human beings like us, then there is not really a question of human rights. And if you scratch under the skin of almost every Israeli, you will find it there. Almost no one will treat the Palestinians as equal human beings like us. I once wrote that we treat the Palestinians like animals, and I got so many protest letters from animal rights organizations, rightly so. But by the end of the day, how many Israelis did ever try for a moment to put themselves in the place of the Palestinians for a moment, for one day?
What a great question. How many Israelis have thought about what it would be like to be a Palestinian for one moment, for 1 hour, for one day? How many Israelis have thought about what it would be like to be under brutal occupation, to be treated as subhuman every single day? And if they thought about that, if they put themselves in that position for one moment, for 1 hour, for one day, how long until they too rise up and resist?
I was listening to you a couple of nights ago, and you were talking to these people, and they were saying that Israel, the Jews, did not have the right to gain Israel from the Palestinians. And I was just saying, throughout history, the Jews have been persecuted, obviously, from the Holocaust, and we were granted Israel as a result of this. And I feel that...
granted by whom?
We were granted from Britain and other countries, granted us that.
Well, what right did Britain have to grant you somebody else's country?
Well, it's due because we lost 6 million people.
No. I'm not arguing about that. I'm going to come on to that. But what right did Britain have to grant you somebody else's country?
We had the right because we lost 6 million people and we did not have a home.
Well, yeah, I'm going to ask you for a third time. What right did Britain have to grant you somebody else's country?
Well, they didn't. Well, they were giving us the right because it was they were basically gave us because of the.
But they gave you somebody else's country. That's the point I'm making, Alex. Can you deal with it?
Yeah, but the Jews have also had to. They've dealt with this throughout history.
Well, Alex, I don't know if you came on with a script and you can't deviate from it. Can you please answer that point? And we'll come to the Holocaust and who was responsible for it and who should have paid and what they should have paid for it. But given that you've said Britain granted you, and you're presumably saying you because you're Jewish, somebody else's country, I'm asking you, what right did Britain have to grant you somebody else's country?
Britain, you could say they didn't have a right, but they came in and dealt with us and with the Jews having lost all these lives, and they basically granted us this land. Okay.
Well, I see I'm getting nowhere on this, Alex, so let me deal with your overarching point. Maybe you're just not equipped to deal with the principal point that I have made. The Jews have suffered racist anti-Semitism down the ages in many, many European countries, including our own. They were subject to regular discrimination at best, and pogrom and murder at most. That's undoubtedly true. The one place in the entire world that Jews were neither discriminated against nor subject to pogrom was the Muslim world. In fact, so much was that the case that when Christianity came back to power in Spain, in Andalusia, in the western extent of the Islamic Empire, when the Muslims left, the Jews left with them, because they feared the Christian anti-Semitism which would be unleashed in the wake of the departure of the Islamic civilization in the West. That's why so many Jews are to be found even today, and were to be found in profusion before the creation of the State of Israel, in countries like Morocco and along the North African coast, because under the protection of the Muslims, the Jews left Europe and went to live in North Africa. The Palestine that was wiped off the map when Britain granted you somebody else's country had Jews living side by side with Christians and Muslims for century upon century without the slightest trace of discrimination or violence or pogrom. So, what's happened is that Christian anti-Semitism in Europe, which massacred 6 million Jews in the greatest crime in human history, was paid for not by the Christian countries of Europe that either practiced or turned a blind eye to that anti-Semitism, but was paid by the very people who were completely innocent of that Holocaust, who had never persecuted the Jews, who had never pogromed the Jews. And that seems to me to add insult to the injury suffered by a people whose country was wiped off the map, who were dispersed into exile, to make way for a Zionist idea which was granted to European Jews, because these were the first settlers, granted to European Jews by Britain. And as you have singularly failed, 4 times I asked you, to acknowledge that Britain had no right to give away somebody else's country, one country giving to a second people, the land that actually belonged to a third people, it seems to me an all-round injustice, don't you think, Alex?
Yeah, I agree that they didn't so much have the right, but they were stepping in after the Holocaust to grant it to the Jews. But it was
long before the Holocaust that Britain stepped in. Britain stepped in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration made by the British Minister Balfour on our behalf to a group of atheistic Zionist Jews. I make the point about atheism because it's now claimed that this is some biblical land right, as if God was an estate agent. The men to whom Israel was promised were atheistic Jews. They were not only not speaking for all Jews, they represented at that time in 1917 a tiny proportion of the world's Jews. Most of the world's Jews supported communist or socialist parties and ideas at that time. The Zionists represented a tiny sliver of Jewish opinion at that time. Yet Balfour promised them the land which belonged to a third people, without consulting either the British or the world's Jews, and least of all, consulting the Palestinians.